In mid-April 1945, a German submarine designated U-1-06 was moving submerged off the coast of Scotland, in the cold gray water of the North Atlantic approaches, trying to complete a patrol at a time when the German U-boat arm was already collapsing. Under Allied air power, radar, escorts, and constant surveillance, the boat was not being hunted at that exact moment by a destroyer pressing depth charges into the sea. The crew was not in an active torpedo attack. Inside the pressure hull, the immediate threat came from the submarine itself, from a technical system meant to make life underwater more manageable, and from a procedure that went wrong at the worst possible time. Subscribe to the channel if you want more true Second World War stories, told in a strict documentary style, with the sequence of events explained clearly and without dramatization. U-1-06 was a Type VII U-boat, a class designed for mass production and long Atlantic patrols. By the final months of the war, the Atlantic had become a hostile environment for German submarines. In earlier years, U-boats had operated with more freedom on the surface at night, using speed and visibility to position for attacks and then diving to escape. By 1945, the surface was dangerous almost everywhere. Allied aircraft ranged far from land. Escort carriers pushed air coverage into areas that had once been safer. Radar and improved search tactics made it difficult for a submarine to surface without being detected. This forced submarines to stay submerged more often, and it made every internal system more important because the crew could not simply go up, ventilate, repair, and continue as if the sea were empty. A submarine that stayed down longer depended on batteries, on ventilation discipline, on valves, seals, pumps, and on the ability to keep the inside of the boat habitable. While the outside pressure kept increasing with depth, life inside a Type VII boat was tight and repetitive. The pressure hull was narrow. Passageways were crowded with piping, wiring, and equipment. Men moved past each other sideways. Air carried diesel smell, sweat, oil, and the persistent dampness that came from condensation on cold metal surfaces. Food storage was improvised, often with supplies placed in any available space. Sleep happened in shifts. Many crewmen shared bunks, rotating according to watch schedules. Noise was constant. Even when engines were stopped, the hull carried creaks and subtle vibrations, and the crew could hear water moving along the outside skin. When submerged and running silently, the rules were strict. Conversations were reduced. Unnecessary movement was minimized. Every sound could travel through the hull. Even small noises could become dangerous if an escort ship was close and using hydrophones. In such conditions, sanitation was not a minor comfort issue. It was an engineering challenge. On a surface ship, flushing waste is relatively simple. On a submerged submarine, the outside water pressure can be greater than the internal pressure of the hull. If a waste outlet is open carelessly while the boat is deep, seawater can force its way into the system and then into the boat. For that reason, submarines used valve sequences and sometimes special mechanisms that allowed waste to be expelled, without letting the sea come back through the same path. Some later systems were designed to allow flushing at greater depth by using intermediate chambers that could be sealed, pressurized, and then opened outward in a controlled manner. The intention was practical: reduce the need to surface, reduce time exposed, and allow the crew to function for longer periods submerged. The consequence was complexity. Complexity means procedure. Procedure means that one mistake can have immediate physical consequences. The toilet system associated with U-1-06 is remembered because it was complicated enough that it required training to operate correctly. The system involved multiple valves and a sequence. When used properly, waste could be moved into a chamber, the chamber could be sealed, pressure could be equalized, and then the contents could be discharged. When used improperly, the sequence could allow outside pressure to push seawater backward. In a normal building on land, a plumbing mistake is unpleasant. In a sealed vessel under pressure, it can be deadly. On the patrol in question, a malfunction occurred. It is generally described as a failure or misuse of the high-pressure toilet system that led to seawater entering the submarine. The precise initiating action is often summarized as a toilet not functioning correctly, followed by an attempt to fix or operate it. That resulted in valves being handled in the wrong order. The critical outcome was not embarrassment, it was flooding. Seawater came into the boat through the sanitation system and began moving into areas where it could do real damage. Flooding inside a submarine is not like water spilling on a floor. The interior is segmented but interconnected through lower spaces, bilges, and conduits. Water flows down quickly. It seeks the lowest points. If it reaches electrical systems, it can short them. If it reaches the battery compartment, it can create a hazardous chemical environment. The battery banks in a Type 7 were central to underwater movement. When the boat submerged, diesel engines could not run because they required air and produced exhaust. The submarine used electric motors powered by batteries. Those batteries were large and filled much of the lower hull. Battery compartments were dangerous under the best conditions. They could release hydrogen gas during charging and discharging, which required ventilation discipline. They involved acid and heavy electrical capacity. Saltwater intrusion into these systems was a major emergency because it could trigger reactions and create toxic gases. The gas most often associated with this incident is chlorine, which is extremely dangerous in confined spaces. Chlorine gas irritates eyes and airways immediately. At higher concentrations, it damages lungs and can incapacitate or kill quickly. In a submarine, where escape is limited and ventilation options are constrained by tactical necessity, chlorine gas is a serious threat. The sequence, in practical terms, became a chain reaction. A sanitation system failure led to seawater entering the hull. That water reached or affected battery-related systems. Toxic fumes were released. The interior environment became unsafe to breathe. Once the air inside a submarine becomes poisonous, the tactical situation becomes secondary. The boat can be the quietest object in the ocean, but if the crew cannot breathe, stealth is useless. At that moment, the commanding officer faced a decision. Remaining submerged reduced the chance of being detected. Surfacing increased the chance of being attacked. But remaining submerged with chlorine gas spreading would mean the crew could be incapacitated before they could control the boat. A submarine cannot be operated by unconscious men. If the crew collapses, the boat either floods further, loses control of buoyancy, and sinks, or it drifts until it is found, or it becomes a sealed tomb underwater. Surfacing, even if dangerous, offered immediate access to fresh air. It also allowed a chance to ventilate the interior and to manage the emergency more effectively. The decision was made to surface. When a U-boat surfaces near enemy-controlled waters, it becomes vulnerable rapidly. In the final months of the war, waters around Britain and Scotland were heavily patrolled. Aircraft search patterns, coastal radar coverage, and escort routes made detection likely. Even if the immediate area seemed quiet at the moment of surfacing, it could change within minutes. An aircraft could appear unexpectedly. A patrol craft could be nearby. A surfaced U-boat was visible, and it also produced a radar return. The boat might attempt to crash dive if threatened, but crash diving required the interior to be manageable. If chlorine gas was present and flooding had affected systems, diving might be impossible or could be fatal. The boat surfaced and the crew took in fresh air, but the act of surfacing exposed them to the enemy environment they were trying to avoid. Reports commonly describe that Allied forces detected the submarine and attacked. The attacker is often described as an aircraft, which fits the broader pattern of late-war anti-submarine warfare in the area. A surface U-boat could be attacked with bombs, rockets, or gunfire. Even near misses could damage the hull or external fittings. More importantly, any attack in that situation forced the crew to choose between fighting, diving, or abandoning. Fighting on the surface against an aircraft was rarely a good exchange for a late-war U-boat. Diving might not be possible due to internal conditions. That left abandonment and scuttling. A German submarine crew was trained not to allow the boat to be captured intact if there was time to prevent it. Capturing a U-boat could give the enemy intelligence, equipment, procedures, navigation materials, and sometimes code-related items depending on what remained on board. By 1945, much of the intelligence war had advanced, but the doctrine of denial remained. If a U-boat was disabled on the surface and threatened with capture, scuttling was a standard option. Scuttling could be done by opening sea valves, setting charges, or using other measures to ensure the boat sank. The goal was to prevent the enemy from taking the vessel as a prize and to force the situation into one of rescue and capture of the crew rather than seizure of the platform. U-1-06 was scuttled and sank off Scotland. The patrol ended immediately. The crew, having abandoned ship, were taken prisoner. In most accounts, there were casualties, but a significant portion of the crew survived and entered captivity. For them, the war ended in a way that had nothing to do with torpedo tactics or a duel with a destroyer. It ended with a technical emergency that forced an exposure, an attack that followed, and the loss of their boat by their own decision to sink it rather than lose it intact. This is why the story is remembered as bizarre. It is not because toilets are funny. It is because the public image of a submarine loss is usually a direct combat narrative. People imagine depth charges, a cracking hull, a dramatic last message. In reality, submarine operations were full of failures that never made headlines. Valves jammed, engines failed, batteries produced dangerous gases, fires started in electrical panels. Men were injured in mundane ways that became life-threatening because medical resources were limited. A submarine is not only a weapon, it is a fragile environment that must be maintained constantly. To keep human beings alive under pressure, the sea does not need to be an enemy to kill you. It only needs a path inside dot to make the incident concrete. It helps to focus on the physical environment and on timing. A submerged U-boat lives on strict routines. The crew has watches. Men are assigned to engine rooms, control room, torpedo room, radio, and lookout when surfaced. When submerged, the boat runs on a careful balance of battery consumption, speed, and stealth. The air inside becomes stale over time, and carbon dioxide levels must be monitored. Ventilation depends on whether the boat can safely use snorkel equipment or surface. And late in the war, snorkel use also carried detection risks. The longer the boat stays down, the more the crew depends on every internal system functioning. A sanitation system is part of that. If it fails, it disrupts not only comfort, but also discipline. It forces movement. It forces troubleshooting. It can distract crew from other tasks. It can create noise. And if it leads to flooding, it becomes a full emergency. The high-pressure toilet system, as described in many retellings, required correct sequencing of valves to prevent the sea from pushing inward. The outside pressure at depth is strong enough to overpower internal pressures if a path exists. A valve opened incorrectly can become that path. Once seawater begins pushing through, it does not politely stop. The crew must isolate the line, close valves, and pump water out. In a narrow hull, water can travel quickly. If the source is not controlled instantly, the volume can build. Even a relatively small volume can reach sensitive components because the submarine is compact and systems are stacked close together. The danger is less about total inundation at first and more about where the water goes. When seawater reaches electrical systems, it can create short circuits. Short circuits can disable pumps and instruments. They can also create sparks and heat, which in an environment with hydrogen risk and limited ventilation can be serious. When seawater reaches battery compartments, the risk becomes chemical. Battery banks in submarines involve acids and reactive materials. Under certain conditions, seawater interacting with battery-related chemicals can produce chlorine gas. Even if the exact chemical pathway depends on battery design, the operational result is clear. Toxic gas appears and spreads. The smell can be sharp. The effect on eyes and lungs is immediate. The crew must use breathing protection if available. But protective gear is limited and not designed for long exposure. Even with protection, the boat must be ventilated or the crew will not be able to continue operating at full capacity. The commanding officer, faced with that environment, must consider not only detection risk, but crew performance. A submarine mission is meaningless if the crew is incapacitated. Also, gas hazards can cause panic. Training tries to prevent panic, but human bodies react. Coughing and choking can spread through a compartment quickly. Men begin to move more rapidly. That creates noise. Noise increases the chance of detection if an escort ship is near. So even if the boat remains submerged, the emergency could compromise stealth anyway. Surfacing becomes the least bad option. When the boat surfaced, the crew likely attempted to ventilate and to manage the emergency. But the late war patrol environment near the British Isles made that surface interval extremely dangerous. Allied anti-submarine warfare near Scotland included aircraft that could respond quickly to sightings. Coastal areas also had patrol vessels and radar. The U-boat might have been spotted visually or detected by radar. Once detected, an aircraft attack could come fast. A surface U-boat had limited options. Its speed on the surface was not enough to outrun an aircraft. Its anti-aircraft weapons were not reliable protection. Crash diving required time and internal readiness. If the interior remained compromised by gas and flooding, crash diving could mean sinking out of control or suffering further casualties inside. In many late war incidents, U-boat crews chose to abandon when attacked on the surface if the boat was already compromised. This was not cowardice. It was practical. A hit on the pressure hull or the conning tower could make diving impossible. Continuing to fight could mean losing the crew along with the boat. By 1945, the strategic situation for Germany was deteriorating rapidly. Saving the boat for future patrols was less realistic. Saving the crew was often the remaining rational priority when scuttling occurs. The crew must execute it quickly and orderly. Sensitive materials are destroyed or thrown overboard if possible. Sea valves may be opened. Internal vents may be used to ensure the boat does not remain afloat long enough for capture. Then the crew goes over the side into cold water. Cold water off Scotland in April can cause hypothermia quickly. Survival depends on rescue speed. In an attack scenario, the enemy may still be present, but after the boat is sinking, the immediate objective becomes capturing survivors and preventing further danger. The crew, now in the water, has little control. They will be picked up by the attacking forces or nearby vessels. They will be taken ashore, interrogated, and held as prisoners. The contrast between the technical trigger and the strategic setting is why the incident stands out. It happened in a period when U-boats were under intense pressure. Late-war German submarines faced improved Allied technology and tactics. Their survival depended on minimizing time on the surface and on keeping internal systems working. That created incentives to adopt and rely on systems like high-pressure sanitation. A system designed to reduce surfacing risk contributed to an incident. That forced surfacing at the worst time. That is the central irony, but in documentary terms it is not irony. It is system interaction. A technical improvement can create new failure modes. A procedure can be safe 99 times and catastrophic on the 100th. Under wartime stress, fatigue and pressure increase the likelihood of procedural mistakes. Under ocean pressure, the consequences become immediate. It is also important to place this in the broader reality of U-boat service. German submariners were trained and often highly motivated, but they also faced harsh conditions. Patrols could last weeks. Food and water were limited. Hygiene was difficult. Men lived in close proximity. Stress was constant because any contact with the enemy could lead to death. Sleep was fragmented. Noise, discipline, and combat readiness demanded constant attention. Under these conditions, even routine tasks could become harder. A complicated toilet procedure requiring careful sequencing was another task that could fail under fatigue or under the urgency of an immediate need. When it failed, it was not a joke to the men involved. It was an emergency that threatened their lives before the enemy even appeared. The name often associated with command of U-1 to 06 in this period is Karl Adolf Schlitt, an officer who took the boat on its first patrol. The boat itself was relatively new and had not built a long combat record before being lost. That matters because new boats could have teething issues, and crews could still be adapting to systems. Late-war German industry was also under bombing pressure, material shortages, and rapid production demands. Quality control challenges could contribute to mechanical vulnerabilities. Even if the toilet failure began with a procedural error, a fragile component, poor maintenance conditions, or design complexity could have made the situation more likely from the Allied perspective. The result was simple. A U-boat surfaced. It was attacked. It sank. Survivors were captured. That was a success in a campaign that had already shifted strongly in Allied favor. Allied commanders did not need to know the internal reason the boat surfaced. Their job was to exploit the opportunity. Anti-submarine warfare in 1945 was designed to turn brief exposure into destruction quickly. The fact that the boat surfaced due to internal crisis only made the opportunity easier to exploit. From the German crew perspective, the event would have felt like a collapse of control. Submarine crews rely on control. Control of depth, trim, buoyancy, speed, sound, and internal environment. A toilet failure that triggered flooding and gas would have felt like a betrayal of the routine. A basic human function became a threat vector. The crew would have been forced into rapid damage control. Damage control in a submarine is physically demanding. Men must locate the leak, close valves, use pumps, isolate compartments, and monitor air quality. They must do this while submerged and possibly while also listening for enemy sounds. When gas is present, they must do it while their eyes burn and their lungs tighten. When the captain orders surfacing, the crew must execute ballast changes and bring the boat up carefully, avoiding broaching it violently while still managing internal emergency conditions. Then, when the boat breaks the surface and fresh air enters, the crew has only a short window before detection and attack becomes likely. The psychological swing from suffocation risk to immediate external threat is severe. Once attacked, the crew must shift again. They must decide whether to attempt an anti-aircraft response, whether to dive, whether to run, or whether to abandon and scuttle. Scuttling requires discipline. The crew must act in an organized sequence, even when bombs or rockets may be falling nearby. Men must move quickly on a wet deck. They must avoid being hit by gunfire or debris. They must prepare to enter cold water. Each step carries risk, and mistakes can kill. The outcome, in documentary terms, is that the submarine was lost and the crew was captured. The incident ended the patrol prematurely and removed the boat from the war. It also created a lasting anecdote that spread widely after the war, because it seemed to summarize the absurdity of late-war desperation. But a documentary view should avoid treating it as comedy. It should treat it as an illustration of how war is often decided by systems and constraints, rather than by dramatic confrontations alone. In the late phase of the Battle of the Atlantic, the U-boat arm had already suffered catastrophic losses. Earlier in the war, German submarines had caused severe shipping losses to Britain and the Allies. Over time, Allied countermeasures improved. Radar improved detection of surface submarines. Aircraft patrols closed gaps in the Atlantic. Escort groups became more effective at hunting, not only defending. Code breaking and signals intelligence contributed in some cases to route prediction and response. Technology, such as improved sonar, better depth charge tactics, and forward-throwing weapons increased kill probability. By 1945, a U-boat commander understood that the operational environment was largely against him. Many patrols ended without success. Many ended with the boat destroyed. The mission continued because the German state demanded it, and because some commanders still hoped for targets or for a shift that would not come. A single incident like U-1-06 did not change the course of that campaign. It is remembered because it is unusual in its trigger, not because it is unique in its underlying mechanism. Many submarines were lost due to mechanical failures combined with enemy exploitation. Fires, battery issues, ventilation failures, snorkel problems, flooding from seals, and procedural errors could all force boats to surface or to abandon stealth at the wrong time. The sea is unforgiving. A complex platform operating under pressure requires perfect operation, more often than humans can realistically deliver under stress. When the margin for error shrinks, unusual triggers become lethal. If you imagine the interior of the boat at the moment the gas appeared, the event becomes easier to understand. Men are in compartments performing routine tasks. Then an alarm or a call comes. A leak is reported. Water is present. Someone is ordered to close valves or to assist. The air begins to change. Eyes sting. Throats tighten. The command is given to bring the boat up. Men brace. The boat ascends. The pressure changes. The conning tower hatch is opened. Fresh air enters. For a moment there's relief. Then the outside world returns, and with it the threat of aircraft or patrol ships. A lookout spots something or a sound is heard. Then the attack begins. Orders are shouted. Men scramble. The decision is made to abandon. The boat is scuttled. The crew goes into the sea. They are captured. That is the real rhythm of the incident. It is not a single funny cause. It is a cascade that took a crew from routine to emergency to captivity in a short span. After capture, the surviving crew would have been processed as prisoners of war. By late April and early May 1945, the war in Europe was ending rapidly. Prisoners captured in that period often experienced a short captivity before the formal end of hostilities. Interrogations might still occur, but the overall strategic urgency was changing. For many captured sailors, the psychological shift from being active combatants to being prisoners was abrupt. They had been trained to fight and to accept a certain fatalism at sea. Then they were suddenly out of the war. Their boat was gone. Their mission ended not with a successful attack, but with an internal failure. That would have added a specific kind of bitterness and embarrassment. Even if survival is ultimately what matters, the wreck remained on the seabed off Scotland, becoming part of a long list of wartime wrecks around the British Isles. Over time, wrecks become historical sites. They attract divers and researchers. They preserve artifacts and structures that can confirm aspects of the loss. They also become memorials, whether officially or informally, because they mark where men fought and where some died. U-1-06 is notable in that context because it is linked to a story that is widely repeated, but it is also one wreck among many from a campaign that killed tens of thousands of sailors. On all sides, the reason the documentary tells this story is not to laugh at sanitation. The reason is to show that war is not only battle plans and heroics. War is also logistics, engineering, maintenance, and procedure. It is the interaction between human limitations and technical systems. Under extreme physical constraints, a toilet system failure seems trivial until it is placed inside a pressure hull underwater, near an enemy coast at the end of a long war. Then it becomes a fatal vulnerability. The sea pressure does not care whether the leak began in a torpedo tube or in a waste line. It only cares that a path exists. Once a path exists, water enters. Once water enters, secondary hazards follow. Once secondary hazards appear, tactical choices narrow. That is the mechanics of disaster. U-1-06 sank because a chain began with a failure that forced seawater into the hull and ended with a forced surfacing that exposed the boat to a light attack. The enemy did not need to win a duel. The enemy only needed to be present in the environment. The internal failure created the exposure. The Allied patrol system exploited it. The crew scuttled the boat and was captured. That is the complete and direct documentary sequence. And it is why this incident remains one of the most unusual submarine losses of the Second World War. If you want, I can now do the next step in your workflow, give you a set of thumbnail ideas in your style. For this story, plus 10 to 15 clean prompts for video generation that match the exact sequence. From submerged routine to the emergency to the surfacing and capture.